Before Clara ever saw his face in person, she saw her own name beside his in a legal document. It was not dramatic in appearance, no bold type, no red flags, just two names aligned on a page that would quietly rearrange the architecture of her life. In that instant, something inside her shifted with a clarity she had learned to trust. This was not a case about rehabilitation. It was not a story about compassion. It was about risk. Not professional risk, not reputational risk, existential risk. The kind that altered the internal geometry of a person long before consequences became visible. She was not his attorney. She was not his court-appointed therapist. She had not volunteered for the assignment. She had been selected as a solution, a softer alternative to confinement, a human mechanism for deflection. The system had identified her as a gentler route for a man who had built his identity on destruction, and in doing so, it had placed her inside the trajectory of someone who did not merely collapse under pressure, but radiated it outward. Miles Harper was not a private disaster. He was public. His face had sold movies, scandals, tabloid cycles, and a mythology carefully curated around volatility. The industry called it genius. The press called it controversy. The courts called it escalation. Explosive outbursts, alcohol-fueled incidents, public altercations, a pattern of damage that no longer looked accidental or youthful. It no longer read as rebellion. It read as inevitability. A descent that had been slow enough for the public to romanticize and fast enough to outpace any genuine intervention. The judge assigned to his case had refused the predictable routes. No anger management seminars designed to be forgotten. No performative remorse. The man believed in transformation, or at least in the optics of it. He believed that the right kind of intervention could interrupt a downward spiral. And so, instead of sentencing, he redirected. He placed Miles in Clara's orbit. Clara had left the film industry years earlier, not in a blaze of scandal or failure, but in a quiet recognition that she had become addicted to a particular kind of oxygen. Attention, validation, the subtle intoxication of being watched. She had not fallen from relevance, she had stepped away from it. In its place, she had built a practice centered on presence, on the difficult labor of turning inward without anesthetic. Meditation, awareness, the cultivation of attention as an act of resistance against the reflex to escape oneself. She did not believe in redemption as spectacle. She did not believe in sudden transformations. She believed in process, in friction, in the slow, often humiliating work of facing what one had spent a lifetime avoiding. She believed in pain as a teacher. And still, nothing in her philosophy prepared her for the first moment he occupied her space. When Miles Harper crossed the threshold of her studio, the atmosphere did not shift through noise or intimidation. It shifted through density, a kind of gravitational pressure that did not announce itself as threat, but as presence. He did not enter like someone asking for help. He entered like someone testing a perimeter. He did not look at her as a healer. He did not look at her as authority. He looked at her as a boundary. Something that existed to be approached, evaluated, perhaps breached. The sensation that moved through her in that moment was not fear. It was not revulsion. It was not even resistance. It was recognition. A low, dangerous awareness that whatever existed between them would not be safe, and that the part of her that had dedicated itself to stillness had just encountered something that would not be stilled by intention alone. This was not attraction in its romantic form. It was tension. Viscous, subterranean, unclean. The kind of pull that did not promise fulfillment, but transformation through collision. Clara had worked with people on the edge before. Addicts, abusers, men and women whose lives had narrowed into corridors of compulsion. She was not naive about darkness. She did not confuse empathy with permission. But Miles Harper was not simply another person in pain. He was a person who carried his pain outward, who made his interior chaos the environment of everyone around him. He did not ask for guidance. He assessed her. He did not seek refuge. He mapped vulnerability. The hook of this story did not lie in the fact that he was volatile. It lay in what Clara understood immediately, without evidence, without narrative, that if she allowed him proximity, the structure she had spent years building inside herself would be compromised, that her carefully constructed distance from the world she had left would not survive sustained contact with someone who did not recognize limits as anything other than obstacles. And still, that awareness did not produce withdrawal. It produced inevitability. Because beneath the danger, beneath the aggression refined into charm, she perceived something else. Not innocence, not goodness, but a fracture so old and so deeply embedded that it no longer presented itself as suffering. It presented itself as entitlement to destruction. A man who had learned that power could replace connection, that control could substitute for intimacy, that dominance could stand in for being seen. He did not want to be saved. He wanted to be encountered. And that was the most dangerous desire of all. The system had chosen her because she represented the opposite of everything that had failed him. Where the industry had rewarded excess, she offered discipline. Where the media had amplified spectacle, she cultivated silence. Where his life had been structured around taking, she practiced release. On paper, the alignment made sense. In reality, it placed her directly in the path of a force that did not dissipate through calm, but reacted to it. Clara understood the kind of man he was not through rumor, but through the subtle mechanics of his attention. The way his gaze did not linger on her face, but on the edges of her posture. The way he seemed less interested in what she offered than in how far she would allow him to go. He did not flirt in the traditional sense. He did not charm with compliments. He created pressure by existing as if the space belonged to him. And yet, what unsettled her most was not his power. It was her response to it. Her training had taught her to observe sensation without attachment, to note attraction, aversion, fear, without allowing any of them to dictate action. But the sensation that arose in his presence did not fit neatly into any category she recognized. It was not desire in the conventional sense. It was not anxiety. It was an awareness that something essential within her was being addressed by something essential within him, and that the meeting of those two currents would not be neutral. It would be catalytic. Clara had built her life around the refusal to be consumed by other people's storms. She had learned to remain intact in proximity to chaos. She had made a practice of standing at the center of her own experience rather than dissolving into someone else. But Miles did not simply bring chaos. He embodied it in a way that was intimate, personal, directed. He did not seek to overwhelm the room. He sought to locate the fault lines. And in her, he found something that resisted him without retreating. That resistance did not challenge him. It intrigued him. This was the true danger. Not that he would harm her directly, though that possibility was not absent, but that he would pull her into a narrative that would erode the very principles she believed defined her. That he would not destroy her through violence or domination, but through proximity. Through making her question the necessity of the boundaries that had kept her alive. She had not agreed to be his redeemer. She had been assigned as his alternative. A softer route through a system that had run out of patience. But in that first encounter, Clara recognized something no document could convey. This was not a man who could be redirected without consequence. This was not a case that could be managed through technique alone. This was a human presence that would not remain contained within the framework she had built. He did not come to be changed. He came to test what could change him, and what would be lost in the process. The realization did not frighten her into retreat. It anchored her. Because the part of her that had walked away from a world built on attention, seduction, and power recognized in him the most dangerous iteration of that world. The very forces she had rejected now stood before her in human form, looking at her not as someone who had escaped, but as someone who could be pulled back in. This was not coincidence. It was convergence. She understood that the choice before her was not simply whether to help him. It was whether she was willing to stand inside a field of gravity that could unmake her. The first 90 seconds of their proximity did not contain overt conflict. There were no raised voices, no explicit threats, no visible struggle. And yet, beneath the surface of that stillness, a confrontation had already occurred. Not between two people, but between two worldviews. One built on control, dominance, and the right to take. The other built on restraint, awareness, and the refusal to be possessed. Miles Harper did not see her as a solution. He saw her as an edge. And Clara saw him not as a problem to be solved, but as a force that would demand something from her she was not yet certain she could give without breaking. The promise of this story was not redemption. It was collision. Because in that first moment, before trust, before transgression, before any visible line had been crossed, Clara already knew what made him impossible and what made him inescapable. If she allowed him to move closer, the life she had constructed would not survive intact. And the most dangerous truth of all was that a part of her understood this and did not step away. Not out of naivete, but out of recognition. Out of the awareness that some encounters are not meant to preserve who we are. They are meant to reveal what we are willing to lose. And in that recognition, the story had already begun. Miles did not arrive as a man searching for a way out. He arrived as a man accustomed to taking space, attention, advantage. His presence carried the quiet assumption of entitlement, as though every environment he entered existed to be measured against his will. Where others sought sympathy, he displayed indifference. Where others attempted compliance, he applied pressure. His irony was not a shield. It was a blade. His aggression was not impulsive. It was calibrated. Even his boredom felt deliberate, a performance designed to destabilize, to force response. Clara recognized the pattern immediately. He did not come to be changed. He came to see what could not be changed in her. Every session unfolded as a series of small invasions. He interrupted silence with commentary that masqueraded as humor. He questioned the legitimacy of her work not out of curiosity, but as an act of dominance. He tested the edges of her composure by refusing to meet her where she stood, by dragging each attempt at stillness into spectacle. What she offered as practice, he treated as provocation. What she intended as grounding, he reframed as constraint. Yet what unsettled her was not the antagonism itself. It was the precision of it. Miles did not resist blindly. He resisted with intent. He identified the spaces in which she expected compliance and withheld it. He located the moments where her discipline relied on cooperation and removed himself from it. He did not disrupt at random. He disrupted at points of vulnerability. His behavior was not the chaos of someone spiraling. It was the strategy of someone who understood that attention could be weaponized. But Clara did not respond as others had. She did not retreat into authority. She did not attempt to outmaneuver him with intellect or rhetoric. She did not escalate. She remained where she was, unflinching, refusing to match his force with counterforce. Instead of correcting him, she observed him. Instead of defending her methods, she allowed his resistance to reveal itself. And in that reflection, she saw what he was truly fighting. Beneath the cultivated cynicism lay an absence so severe it bordered on erasure. This was not romantic emptiness, not the tragic hollow of a misunderstood soul. It was structural. Miles could not inhabit silence without disintegrating. The removal of stimulation did not calm him, it exposed him. Stillness did not soothe, it threatened. Any moment not occupied by noise, attention, or dominance became an abyss in which he could not stand. He did not know how to exist with himself. The absence of external engagement triggered something close to panic, though he would never have named it as such. He responded to that internal collapse by asserting control over his environment. by provoking reaction, by ensuring that something, anything, was happening. If he could not fill the space with meaning, he would fill it with disruption. Clara had witnessed variations of this pattern before, but never with this level of sophistication. He was not simply avoiding discomfort. He was constructing an identity around the refusal to be contained by any framework that did not privilege him. He had learned, over years of attention and consequence-free transgression, that resistance itself could be converted into leverage, that people would accommodate him rather than confront him, that systems would bend rather than break him. She did not attempt to dismantle that identity directly. She did something far more destabilizing. She allowed him to see it. Without accusation, without moralization, without drama. She held his actions up not as offenses to be corrected, but as mechanisms of his own suffering. She showed him how every attempt to dominate was also an attempt to escape, how every interruption was a refusal to feel, how every moment of superiority was built on the terror of being irrelevant. This was not compassion in the sentimental sense. It was precision. For the first time in his life, Miles encountered something he could not manipulate. He could not buy her compliance. He could not intimidate her into silence. He could not seduce her into complicity. She did not respond to his power because she did not recognize it as power. To her, it was a symptom. And that infuriated him. It was one thing to be punished. He had learned how to perform remorse when necessary. It was another to be reflected back to himself without judgment, without interest in controlling him. He was accustomed to environments structured around reaction, applause, condemnation, fascination. Clara offered none of these. She did not reward his volatility. She did not shame it. She simply remained present, unaltered by his attempts to destabilize. The absence of reaction was intolerable. His behavior intensified not because she was failing, but because she was succeeding in a way that threatened his internal order. Each time she refused to be moved, something inside him collapsed further. Not because she was winning, but because she was refusing to participate in the game altogether. And in that refusal, she became something new to him. Not an adversary. Not an audience. Not a conquest. A limit. Not a limit imposed through authority, but one embodied through coherence. He had built his life around the premise that every boundary could be negotiated, every person reduced to a function of his desire. He had never encountered someone whose presence did not respond to pressure in predictable ways. Clara did not harden. She did not retreat. She did not escalate. She simply remained herself. The effect was disorienting. The tension between them did not resemble flirtation. There was no lightness, no exchange of charm. What developed was something far more primal, the friction between two unresolved wounds. His need to be seen at any cost collided with her compulsion to remain useful even when utility became self-betrayal. His hunger for recognition met her capacity to witness without absorption. She did not offer him validation. She offered him visibility. And visibility, for someone who had survived through performance, was far more threatening than rejection. Clara began to understand that Miles was not searching for a solution. He was searching for a person who could withstand him, someone who would not collapse under his weight, someone who would not become smaller in his presence, someone who would not be consumed by the narrative he constructed around himself. He did not want rescue. He wanted endurance. And in remaining with him without submission, without fascination, without fear, she became the first person in his life who did not disappear inside his gravity. This did not soften him. It sharpened him. His challenges became more precise, his provocations more intimate. He began to probe not her philosophy, but her history. He watched the moments when her attention wavered, when her composure thinned, when the part of her that wanted to be necessary surfaced. He did not do this with cruelty. He did it with the instinct of someone who had learned to read others as terrain. Clara was aware of the shift even before she could articulate it. The sessions were no longer about his resistance to practice. They had become about the dynamic between them, about what each represented to the other, about what he sought in her that he could not find elsewhere. What unsettled her most was not the intensity of his focus. It was the resonance. She recognized in herself the same dangerous impulse she had left behind when she walked away from the world that had once defined her. The impulse to be the one who could reach what others could not, to be the exception, to be the person whose presence could alter the trajectory of a life. She had built her entire practice on the dismantling of that desire. And now it was resurfacing in the most perilous form possible. Miles was not asking for guidance. He was asking, without words, whether she would remain when the cost became personal, whether her commitment to presence could survive proximity to someone who did not seek equilibrium, but intensity, whether she would hold her ground when the work was no longer abstract, when it began to implicate her own vulnerabilities. She told herself that what she felt was responsibility. But beneath that lay something far less neutral. She was beginning to care whether he broke or did not break. Not as a professional outcome, as a personal one. The awareness did not arrive as desire. It arrived as gravity, a pull that did not promise satisfaction but demanded engagement, a recognition that this was no longer merely a case. This was a confrontation between two ways of surviving the world. His, built on domination. Hers, built on detachment. Neither was neutral. Neither was without cost. As the days unfolded, Clara observed the subtle changes in him that no one else could have seen. The way his provocations began to carry fatigue rather than triumph. The way his interruptions no longer felt like displays of power, but like symptoms of restlessness he could not silence. The way his attempts to control the environment increasingly revealed how little control he had over himself. He had never learned to sit inside discomfort. He had learned only to escape it. And she was the first person who did not provide him with an exit. That was why he kept returning. Not because he wanted what she offered, but because he could not dismantle what she represented. She did not attempt to convert him. She did not offer him hope. She offered him reality. And reality, unfiltered by narrative or performance, was something he had spent his life avoiding. The tension between them was not romantic. It was existential. It asked a question neither of them could ignore. What happens when a force built on control encounters a presence that cannot be controlled? For Clara, the danger lay not in his volatility, but in her response to it, in the part of her that felt awakened by the challenge, in the part of her that recognized in him a mirror of everything she had once been drawn to and had deliberately abandoned. She began to understand that he was not simply testing her professional boundaries. He was testing the integrity of her identity. He was asking, without asking, whether the principles she lived by could withstand a human being who refused to be simplified, healed, or contained. And the most terrifying realization of all was that she did not want to turn away. Not because she believed she could save him, but because she sensed that in facing him, she would be forced to confront the limits of her own philosophy. He did not seek help. He sought the edge of another person. And in becoming that edge, Clara found herself standing at the threshold of a transformation she had never intended to undergo. Not the transformation of a man who might or might not change, but the transformation of a woman who was discovering how much of herself she was willing to risk in the presence of someone who could dismantle everything she had worked to become. The danger was no longer hypothetical. It was relational. And it was only beginning. The deeper the process went, the thinner the boundaries became. What had begun as a structured intervention slowly lost the architecture that had once defined it. Miles no longer arrived as a man under legal supervision. He no longer carried the posture of someone passing through an obligation. He came as a presence that resisted the identity he had worn for years, as if something in the proximity of Clara had made the performance of his former self feel suddenly unbearable. He did not announce the change. There was no declaration, no narrative of transformation. It revealed itself in absences, in the way his provocations diminished, in the way silence no longer provoked immediate resistance, in the way his eyes no longer searched the room for points of leverage, but lingered on nothing at all. He began to allow moments without interruption. He began to remain where previously he would have fled. For a man whose life had been constructed around attention, this stillness was not peace. It was exposure. Miles had always defined himself in relation to an audience. Whether that audience applauded or condemned had never mattered. What mattered was the confirmation of existence that came from being seen. When attention disappeared, something in him collapsed. He had spent years outrunning that collapse through excess, through conflict, through any stimulus that would prevent him from encountering the interior void that waited beneath the surface of his persona. In Clara's presence, that avoidance became increasingly difficult. Not because she demanded introspection, but because she did not offer escape. She did not fill the silence for him. She did not provide distraction. She allowed space to exist, and in that space, he was forced to remain with what he had always refused to face. The fear of becoming nothing when the world was no longer watching. The terror that his value was inseparable from the spectacle he generated. The realization that without performance, without chaos, he did not know who he was. He began to speak of this not as confession, but as observation. Not as vulnerability offered for sympathy, but as something discovered through the absence of noise. He did not dramatize it. He simply acknowledged it, as though numbing the void might make it less absolute. Clara saw the shift and misunderstood its meaning. She had always believed that awareness preceded change, that once a person could observe their own patterns without illusion, transformation became possible. And in Miles, she recognized something that resembled that first step. He was no longer purely reactive. He was beginning, in fragmented ways, to notice himself. For Clara, this recognition was intoxicating in its own quiet way. Not because she desired him, but because she saw in him what she had spent her life trying to cultivate in others. The capacity to remain present with one's own darkness without fleeing. Where once she had perceived him as a force that could not be contained, she began to see him as a human being whose violence was not simply directed outward, but born from a desperate need to avoid an interior collapse. The man who had entered her space as a destabilizing presence now appeared as someone who was suffering, not in a way that sought pity, but in a way that demanded confrontation. And in that shift, she made the first of a series of mistakes she would only later understand. She began to feel responsible not only for his progress, but for his isolation. Miles did not speak of loneliness as a condition. He spoke of it as a structure. His life was full of people, of encounters, of constant motion. And yet nothing in it created continuity. Every relationship existed within a hierarchy of power, performance, or utility. He was either being admired, resented, or used. He was never simply accompanied. Clara had built her life around the idea that no one could be saved by another person. That autonomy was non-negotiable. That compassion did not require proximity. That one could witness suffering without becoming its container. And yet, as Miles allowed himself to be still in her presence, as he revealed not his past but his interior landscape, something in her shifted from observation to involvement. She no longer saw him solely as someone navigating his own process. She began to perceive him as someone whose survival depended, in some undefined way, on the continuity of their connection. It did not arrive as romantic longing. It arrived as obligation. The belief that if she withdrew, something fragile in him would collapse. She told herself that this was empathy, that it was natural to care about the consequences of one's work, that responsibility was not attachment. But beneath that rationalization lay something far more dangerous, the quiet emergence of the belief that she was necessary. She had spent years dismantling the desire to be indispensable. She had seen what that desire did to those who built their identities around saving others. She knew how easily care could become control, how effortlessly concern could transform into possession. And yet, with Miles, she began to cross the line she had always sworn was inviolable. She allowed the personal to enter the professional. Not in any single, dramatic moment, but through a series of small permissions. Extended conversations that drifted beyond the structure of their sessions. The sharing of fragments of herself she had never offered to those she worked with. The subtle softening of distance. The unspoken agreement that what existed between them was no longer contained within the frame that had originally defined it. Their closeness did not erupt into passion. It unfolded as erosion. A slow movement into territory neither of them named, but both recognized. Care became concern. Concern became attachment. Attachment began to resemble desire, not in its physical expression, but in its emotional gravity. The desire not to lose access to the other. The desire to remain significant in each other's internal worlds. For Miles, this shift carried a meaning he had never been taught to question. In his experience, boundaries were either obstacles to be overcome or structures that defined ownership. If a boundary could be crossed, it meant access. If access was granted, it meant possession. He did not distinguish between intimacy and entitlement. He had learned that proximity conferred rights. Clara did not see this at first. She interpreted his closeness as trust, as vulnerability, as the result of a man finally lowering the defenses that had isolated him. She believed that what was emerging between them was a fragile space of mutual recognition, something neither exploitative nor transactional. But she misread the language of a man who had never known intimacy without hierarchy. For Miles, her willingness to blur the line did not signal connection. It signaled permission. Not to love, but to claim. Where she felt herself stepping closer in compassion, he experienced the dissolution of a limit. Where she perceived a deepening of human connection, he perceived confirmation that the structures that had always governed his relationships remained intact. That when he pressed against a boundary, it would eventually yield. The realization did not come to her through overt action. It arrived through perception. Through the subtle shift in his gaze, where gratitude gave way to expectation. Through the way his presence no longer sought her consent, but assumed it. Through the emerging tone of his attention, which carried not need, but a quiet assertion of right. She began to recognize something in his eyes that had not been there before. Not appreciation, but ownership. The understanding struck her with a clarity that felt almost violent. She was no longer witnessing him from the outside. She had become part of his internal narrative, no longer the guide who stood beside him, but the figure through which he now defined safety, meaning, and direction. She was no longer observing the process. She was inside it. And in that moment, she understood the magnitude of the boundary she had crossed. Her own principles were no longer intact. The foundation of her work had been the refusal to become essential. The insistence that no one could or should be the center of another person's stability. She had believed that true support did not replace self-agency. That to become indispensable was to create dependence, and that dependence, however well-intentioned, was a form of violence. Now, in the space between her and Miles, that violence had begun to take shape. Not through domination, but through entanglement. Every action she took was now layered with meaning it had never carried before. If she offered presence, it could be interpreted as invitation. If she withdrew, it could be experienced as abandonment. If she spoke, it might be read as guidance. If she remained silent, as judgment. She no longer moved freely. She moved within a web of consequence that she herself had helped construct. And what terrified her most was not the impact on him. It was the transformation of her own interior. She felt herself becoming less an observer of suffering and more a participant in it, less a witness and more a figure whose choices could alter another person's emotional survival. She felt the old pull return, the one she had once mistaken for purpose, the belief that being necessary gave meaning. This was the illusion she had built her life to escape. The illusion that one could be the center of another's healing without being consumed by it. The consequences were inevitable, not because Miles acted with malice, but because the dynamic they had entered could not remain stable. He did not possess the internal structures to hold intimacy without control. She did not possess the right to offer connection without containment. Where she had hoped to remain present without attachment, attachment had already taken root. Where she had believed in care without ownership, ownership had already been assumed. The fracture revealed itself not in conflict, but in realization. She saw with devastating clarity that if she did not reestablish the boundary, she would lose not him, but herself. She would lose the integrity that had defined her work, her identity, her very sense of what it meant to be with another human being without dissolving into their needs. This was not a question of ethics alone. It was a question of survival. She had crossed a line she had always known was fatal to any form of genuine help. She had allowed the personal to replace the professional, the emotional to override the structural. She had become not simply involved, but implicated. And in doing so, she had placed herself inside the very pattern she had sought to dismantle. The most painful truth was not that she had misjudged him. It was that she had misjudged herself. She had believed that awareness made her immune to entanglement, that understanding the mechanisms of attachment protected her from them. That insight was enough to prevent repetition. She now saw that knowledge did not confer immunity. It only made the consequences more visible. She did not regret caring for him. She regretted allowing care to become identification. Because in his eyes, she no longer saw gratitude. She saw claim. And in that claim, she recognized the loss of something essential. Her position, her clarity, herself. The boundary she had crossed was not simply a rule she had violated. It was the line that had separated presence from possession. And standing on the wrong side of it, Clara understood that if she did not stop now, she would not merely fail to help him. She would be consumed by the very dynamic she had devoted her life to resisting. She would not lose Miles. She would lose the woman she had become. And that realization marked the end of what had once been possible between them. Because some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be repaired. They can only be recognized, and either reestablished, or allowed to destroy everything that follows. The separation did not bring relief. If anything, it intensified what both of them had been trying, in different ways, to outrun. When Miles returned to the world that had once defined him, nothing in it felt altered on the surface. The same money, the same access, the same unspoken hierarchies that bent toward his name. Invitations resumed. Contracts reopened. The machinery of influence reassembled around him as though his absence had been a minor interruption rather than a fracture. Yet the world no longer worked in the way it once had. The environments that had previously absorbed his volatility now reflected it back to him with an acuity he had never experienced. He moved through rooms that once felt like extensions of his will and found them hollow. Applause registered not as affirmation, but as noise. Conflict no longer offered release. Excess failed to anesthetize what it had always concealed. For the first time, he did not experience his aggression as a form of identity. He experienced it as compulsion. What had once appeared as charisma, as intensity, as the inevitable byproduct of brilliance, revealed itself as something closer to addiction. The impulse to dominate, to provoke, to destabilize was no longer an expression of self. It was a mechanism, a reflex, a dependence on disruption as the only way to avoid the interior stillness that now felt unbearable. And in every moment that impulse arose, he felt the imprint of Clara's presence. Not as memory, not as longing, but as awareness. The space she had forced him to inhabit had not closed when she withdrew. It remained inside him, persistent and unnegotiable. In the instant before he lashed out, he saw the pattern. In the moment he reached for excess, he recognized the escape. He did not become better. He became conscious. And that consciousness, stripped of comfort or illusion, cut deeper than any deception ever could. He could no longer tell himself that he was simply being himself. He could no longer hide behind the myth of inevitability. He saw what he did, and he saw why he did it. The clarity did not liberate him. It tortured him. Awareness without immediate transformation felt like punishment. Each act of aggression now carried the additional weight of recognition. He was not merely acting. He was choosing, again and again, the very behaviors he now understood to be destroying him. The part of him that had once thrived on intensity now encountered it as evidence of his own entrapment. For the first time, he was not merely suffering. He was watching himself suffer. Meanwhile, Clara remained in the aftermath of her own choice. She had reestablished the boundary that should never have been crossed, but the cost of that restoration was far greater than she had anticipated. The separation did not restore neutrality. It exposed the illusion that had sustained her for years, the belief that detachment could exist without loss, that one could withdraw from intimacy without consequence. That care could be offered, then removed, without leaving an imprint. Her practice continued. Her schedule remained full. People still came to her seeking grounding, seeking tools, seeking a language for pain that did not require collapse. On the surface, nothing in her life appeared broken. But beneath that continuity, something fundamental had shifted. Her work was no longer abstract. Every principle she had once taught from a place of intellectual clarity was now charged with personal consequence. The idea of non-attachment, which had once felt like wisdom, now revealed itself as something far more complex. It was easy to speak of distance when the heart was not implicated. It was simple to advise others to release what bound them when one had not yet encountered the gravity of real connection. She had, and it had not behaved as philosophy promised. Clara discovered that awareness did not dissolve attachment. It illuminated it. The very presence she had encouraged in others now forced her to confront what she had never fully acknowledged, that her commitment to autonomy had, in subtle ways, functioned as a shield, not only against dependency, but against vulnerability, against the risk inherent in allowing another person to matter beyond the limits of principle. Her decision to withdraw had been necessary, but it was not painless. She did not mourn Miles as a romantic loss. She mourned something far more disorienting, the collapse of her certainty. The realization that the structures she had built to protect herself from entanglement had also protected her from genuine intimacy. That the distance she had always considered strength had, at times, been another form of avoidance. Her path forward no longer felt like the quiet, disciplined line she had once followed. It felt exposed. Every meditation, every moment of stillness now carried the echo of what she had learned. That detachment was not synonymous with freedom, and that boundaries, while essential, did not insulate the heart from consequence. Externally, the pressure intensified. The legal process that had originally bound her and Miles together moved toward resolution. The court demanded evaluation. The judge required assessment. Her words, her interpretation of his state, would not merely shape a narrative, they would determine outcomes. Whether he would be granted leniency or returned to a system that had never known how to hold him. The responsibility was immense. She had always approached such moments with clarity. She understood that her role was not to save, but to observe honestly. That compassion did not require distortion, that the integrity of her work depended on her refusal to soften reality for the sake of comfort. And yet now, honesty was no longer neutral. Every conclusion she might draw carried consequences not only for him, but for the version of herself that had emerged through their encounter. She felt the pull of two truths that could not be reconciled easily: the knowledge that Miles was changing, and the awareness that change did not guarantee safety. She could see the difference in him. Not through grand gestures, but through absence. He no longer demanded. He no longer attempted to reclaim the dynamic they had abandoned. He did not manipulate through contact or silence. He did not seek to bypass the boundary she had drawn. Where once he had pressed against limits instinctively, he now remained within them with visible effort. For someone whose identity had been built on transgression, restraint was not natural. It was labor. She understood what it cost him to hold himself back, to accept restriction rather than interpret it as challenge, to remain outside her life without attempting to reassert proximity. These were not performances. They were the visible manifestations of a struggle that did not seek recognition. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. Because she recognized in his restraint something she had always believed was possible, yet rarely witnessed: the willingness to endure discomfort without transforming it into power. He was no longer asking. He was no longer demanding. He was waiting. Not in hope of reward, but in acknowledgement of the limits she had set. For a man whose entire existence had been structured around immediate gratification and control, this waiting was almost violent in its effort. She could see it in the tension he carried, in the way he held himself back from reflex, in the way his eyes no longer scanned for advantage, but remained fixed on the present with something approaching endurance. And this recognition brought her to the most painful crossroads of all. She had reasserted the boundary to preserve herself. Now she had to decide what preservation truly meant. She could withdraw entirely, secure the distance that protected her identity, and allow the process to conclude without further entanglement. This path offered clarity, safety, the return to a version of herself that remained untouched by the chaos of another. Or she could risk something far more uncertain. She could test whether proximity could exist without domination, whether presence could be offered without ownership, whether two people shaped by radically different forms of survival could inhabit the same space without collapsing into the dynamics that had once defined them. This was not a romantic dilemma. It was a philosophical one. Her entire worldview rested on the premise that liberation required the dissolution of attachment, that true compassion did not bind, that autonomy was the highest ethical value in any relationship. Yet what she now observed in Miles complicated that certainty. His change was not driven by the desire to possess her. It was driven by the effort to exist without consuming. He was not trying to reclaim what had been lost. He was attempting to become someone who no longer needed to take. And that transformation, however incomplete, confronted her with a question she had never had to answer before. Was it possible to be with another person not as refuge, not as rescuer, not as object of control, but as presence without dominance? She did not romanticize his struggle. She knew too well the fragility of change. Charisma had deceived her before. She had seen countless men perform growth while retaining the structures that made growth impossible. She did not trust easily, and she did not mistake restraint for resolution. But what unsettled her was not the possibility that he might fail. It was the recognition that he was no longer trying to win. He was trying to remain. Within himself. Within the limits she had set. Within the awareness that now governed his actions. And that awareness, unlike any lie he had ever told, demanded something of her. Not forgiveness. Not surrender. But clarity. If she chose to re-enter his orbit, it would not be as savior or guide. It would not be as the figure through which he defined meaning. It would be as a woman who refused to be essential to another's survival and who demanded the same autonomy in return. She understood what was at stake. If she stepped back toward him without vigilance, the old dynamic would reassert itself. His need could become dependence. Her care could become identity. The boundary that had cost her so much to restore could dissolve again, this time with consequences she might not survive intact. But if she remained forever outside, she would be affirming a different kind of fear. That genuine connection was incompatible with integrity. That intimacy inevitably led to possession. That the only way to remain whole was to remain separate. This was the awareness that cut deeper than any deception. Not because it offered answers, but because it dismantled the certainties that had once felt like truth. She could no longer hide behind principle alone. She had to choose what those principles meant in practice. Miles stood at the center of this decision, not as a temptation, not as a project, but as a living question. Could a man whose life had been built on control learn to exist without it? And could a woman whose life had been built on autonomy allow closeness without surrender? Neither of them had proof. Only awareness. And awareness, stripped of illusion, did not comfort. It demanded. The chapter of separation had not resolved their story. It had stripped it of pretense. What remained was not romance, not tragedy, but something far more dangerous. The possibility of a connection that did not promise salvation, only truth. Whether that truth would become liberation or destruction remained unknown. But neither of them could unsee what had been revealed. And in that unseeing, the next choice would define not only their relationship, but the people they were becoming. The culmination did not arrive as confession, redemption, or romantic convergence. It arrived as pressure. It came in the form of expectation that tightened around Miles from every direction at once. The legal system demanded evidence of rehabilitation. The industry demanded a narrative of transformation that could be packaged and sold. His public image required a storyline that would convert volatility into marketable depth. The people who had always benefited from his chaos now insisted that he present a refined version of himself, one that could be forgiven, reintegrated, and once again consumed. What they wanted was not change. They wanted performance. They wanted a controlled version of accountability, one that acknowledged past damage without threatening future profitability. They wanted a man who could claim to have found clarity without relinquishing the structures that had protected him. They wanted the myth of the corrected genius. Flawed, yes, but fundamentally untouchable. For most of his life, Miles would have complied without hesitation. He had been trained to survive through adaptation, through strategic disclosure, through calibrating truth to whatever outcome best preserved his autonomy. His identity had never been static. It had always been shaped by what the moment required. Dangerous when danger was rewarded, repentant when contrition was demanded, charismatic when influence was needed. The world had taught him that authenticity was a luxury, and that survival depended on control. This time, something different occurred. When the moment arrived to present the narrative they were waiting for, he did not step into it. He did not offer the language of recovery that could be translated into headlines. He did not frame his history as a temporary deviation from an otherwise noble trajectory. He did not present his transformation as a completed arc. Instead, he named what remained unresolved. He acknowledged the patterns that still governed him, the dependence on control, the reflex to dominate when confronted with vulnerability, the inability to inhabit stillness without experiencing it as threat. He did not speak of these traits as past mistakes, but as present realities that he was only beginning to understand. He did not ask for absolution. He did not dramatize his suffering. He did not attempt to reshape consequence into spectacle. He accepted what followed as the cost of honesty. The decision did not elevate him. It stripped him. Without the armor of narrative, he stood exposed before a system that had no interest in complexity. The refusal to perform remorse in acceptable terms unsettled those who had anticipated a familiar script. His transparency did not satisfy the desire for reassurance. It disrupted it. It removed the illusion that transformation could be confirmed by words alone. For the first time, Miles did not attempt to negotiate his way out of accountability. He did not try to reclaim control through confession. He did not present himself as someone who had arrived. He presented himself as someone who had stopped pretending. The consequences were immediate and tangible. Opportunities that might have been preserved through careful narrative closed without ceremony. Support that had been conditional on marketability evaporated. The system that had once absorbed his volatility now recoiled from his refusal to package it. There was no spectacle in his honesty, no emotional arc that could be condensed into inspiration. There was only reality. For Clara, this moment arrived not as revelation, but as verification. She had observed his struggle from a distance, resisting the impulse to interpret every restraint as growth and every silence as humility. She had learned too well that charisma could masquerade as sincerity, that intensity could mimic transformation without altering its source. She had maintained the boundary she had fought to restore, not out of punishment, but out of necessity. When the pressure mounted, and the world demanded that he perform his redemption, she watched for the response she had never allowed herself to hope for. She watched to see whether he would choose image or truth. And he chose truth. Not the version of truth that solicited forgiveness. Not the version that promised resolution. But the version that made no claim to completion. She did not interpret his decision as proof that he had become someone safe. She understood too clearly that safety was not a destination, but a continuous negotiation. Patterns could resurface. Struggle did not end simply because it was acknowledged. The person he had been had not vanished. It had been named. What shifted was not who he was. It was how he related to what he was. For Clara, this distinction mattered more than any declaration of reform. She had built her life on the principle that clarity without illusion was the only ethical foundation for connection. She had refused, again and again, to soften reality for the sake of hope. She had left when the boundary was breached not because she did not care, but because she cared enough to refuse a relationship structured by imbalance. Now, confronted with his refusal to perform for power, she recognized something she had not expected to feel again. Not certainty. Possibility. She did not approach this recognition with romantic anticipation. She did not imagine reconciliation as resolution. She did not entertain the fantasy of being the force that would complete his transformation. The idea of becoming anyone's anchor had already proven destructive. Her choice did not emerge from desire. It emerged from alignment. She saw in his decision not a promise of stability, but a refusal of dominance. For the first time, he was not attempting to control the narrative that would define him. He was allowing consequence to exist without manipulation. He was relinquishing the very mechanism that had once structured his identity. And in doing so, he was no longer asking her to carry him. He was no longer positioning her as the axis of his survival. He was not seeking to be saved. He was choosing to remain present within his own incompleteness. This was what shifted the question for her. The relationship she had refused was one in which she would have been required to absorb his instability, to regulate his excess, to become the structure that held him together. That dynamic had never been sustainable. It would have reduced her to function rather than personhood. What now stood before her was something fundamentally different. Not a man transformed, but a man who had stopped asking others to transform him. The clarity of that distinction cut through her remaining defenses. She did not interpret his honesty as virtue. She did not reward it with immediate trust. She did not confuse self-awareness with self-mastery. She remained acutely conscious of the fragility of change, of the ways in which old patterns could reassert themselves under pressure. Her decision was not to forgive. It was to engage. Not as rescuer, not as stabilizer, but as equal. She did not return to him as the woman who had once allowed care to become entanglement. She returned as someone who understood that connection, without illusion, required a different structure entirely. One in which neither person functioned as the other's center. One in which responsibility remained individual, not shared by default. She did not offer safety. She offered possibility. Not the possibility of happiness, or healing, or permanence. The possibility of presence without possession. She made no promises to remain. She made no declarations of faith in his future. She did not ask him to become someone else. What she offered was conditional only on one principle, that neither of them would surrender autonomy in exchange for closeness. This was not reconciliation, as narrative resolution. This was the acceptance of uncertainty as foundation. In choosing him under these terms, she did not abandon her philosophy. She completed it. She acknowledged that detachment was not the absence of connection, but the refusal to collapse into it. That boundaries did not exist to eliminate intimacy, but to make it ethical. That love, if it were to exist at all between two people shaped by power and vulnerability, could not be built on rescue or dependency. It had to be built on responsibility. His for himself, hers for herself. And the space between them had to remain unowned. She did not choose him because he had changed completely. She chose him because he had ceased demanding that she be the solution to his existence. He did not offer her safety. He offered her presence. And for the first time, presence was not accompanied by control. That was the choice she made. Not with hope, not with illusion, but with clarity. A clarity that did not promise outcome, only integrity. And in that integrity, something neither of them had known before became possible. A connection that did not seek to consume, redeem, or define. Only to exist. The ending did not arrive as resolution. It arrived as structure. Miles did not become enlightened. The sharpness in him did not vanish. His temperament remained volatile, his instincts still wired toward intensity, toward dominance, toward the familiar reflex of control when uncertainty pressed too close. The difference was not in who he was, but in how he related to what he was. He no longer mistook impulse for identity. He no longer justified harm as inevitability. He saw the forces that moved him, and though they did not disappear, they no longer ruled him unquestioned. Clara did not become his redeemer. She did not soften his edges for him. She did not absorb his instability. She did not reshape herself into the stabilizing structure that would make his world bearable. The part of her that once sought meaning through usefulness, through being necessary to another, remained present but no longer in command. She did not abandon care. She abandoned the belief that care required self-erasure. What emerged between them was not romance in the way the world defined it. It was not sanctuary. It was not fusion. It was not the familiar narrative of two broken people becoming whole through each other. It was something quieter, more demanding, and far less forgiving: coexistence without ownership. Their relationship was no longer a refuge from consequence. It did not promise escape from the selves they carried. It required them to remain exactly where they were, fully responsible for the lives they had built before and beyond each other. Clara entered his world without illusion. She saw the scale of what surrounded him, the resources, the influence, the systems that had once bent to his will. She did not pretend indifference to the power he held, but she also refused to be defined by it. She did not allow proximity to become absorption. She did not trade autonomy for access. Her presence within his life was not decorative, not dependent, not silent. She did not ask for equality as a gesture. She enacted it as practice. She made decisions without consulting his comfort. She disagreed without apologizing for the tension it created. She maintained a life that did not orbit his. Her work remained her own. Her values remained unnegotiable. When conflict arose, she did not retreat into caretaking, nor did she weaponize distance. She held her ground without performance. Miles responded not with resistance, but with adaptation. Not the strategic adaptation he had mastered in other arenas, but something far more unfamiliar: accommodation without control. He did not attempt to absorb her into his framework. He did not reassert dominance when the dynamic no longer centered him. When she challenged him, he did not escalate. When she withdrew, he did not pursue through pressure. He did not collapse into dependency. He did not demand reassurance. He learned to remain present without possession. This was not passive. It was arduous. Every instinct he had developed over a lifetime resisted this structure. His reflex had always been to secure what mattered by force of will, by negotiation, by leverage. To exist in a connection where none of those tools were permitted required a form of discipline more severe than any external restriction. He failed. Not catastrophically, but honestly. There were moments when the old patterns surfaced, when frustration hardened into control, when his need to dominate returned in subtle forms. In those moments, Clara did not rescue him from himself. She did not soften the consequence. She did not reinterpret his behavior to preserve harmony. She named what she saw and withdrew when necessary, not as punishment, but as boundary. He did not interpret her distance as abandonment. He interpreted it as reality. And reality, for the first time, was something he did not attempt to rewrite. Their bond did not depend on constant closeness. It did not require intensity to sustain itself. There were spaces between them that neither sought to fill. Time apart did not register as threat. Silence did not demand explanation. The absence of urgency was not emptiness, but stability. What they shared was not comfort. It was clarity. They saw each other without myth. Clara did not see a wounded genius in need of salvation. She saw a man capable of harm and capable of restraint. She did not confuse potential with outcome. She did not invest in who he might become at the cost of who he was. Her regard was not conditional on his perfection. It was contingent on his accountability. Miles did not see a moral ideal or a redemptive figure. He did not place on her the burden of meaning. He did not treat her as the axis of his transformation. He recognized her not as anchor, not as guide, but as a separate will whose presence was offered, not owed. What existed between them was not a solution to suffering. It was an agreement to remain awake within it. They did not pretend that love would make the world gentler. They did not imagine that connection would erase conflict. They did not seek in each other a shield from the lives they had chosen. They chose instead to stand side by side within those lives. neither retreating into isolation nor collapsing into fusion. Clara no longer defined herself through the act of healing others. She did not relinquish compassion, but she no longer equated compassion with sacrifice. Her identity was not structured around being indispensable. She moved through her work and her relationships with a clarity that did not require validation through necessity. She was no longer the woman who found purpose in being needed. She was a subject of her own life. Miles was no longer the man to whom everything was permitted. He did not renounce power, but he refused to use it as identity. He did not seek absolution for his past, nor did he perform transformation for acceptance. He learned to inhabit his limitations without converting them into spectacle. He learned to experience desire without demanding fulfillment, to feel intensity without converting it into action, to endure discomfort without externalizing it as domination. He was not healed. He was responsible. The world around them did not soften. The systems that had shaped him did not dissolve. The pressures that had once driven her into distance did not disappear. Conflict remained present. Temptation remained real. The conditions that had produced their earlier collapse were still part of the environment they navigated. What had changed was the structure through which they met those conditions. They did not turn to each other as refuge. They turned to each other as witness. In moments of failure, they did not seek to be saved from consequence. They remained with what was. In moments of connection, they did not cling to it as proof of permanence. They allowed it to exist without demand. Their love was not a remedy. It was not designed to compensate for past wounds or to guarantee future security. It was a deliberate, ongoing act of presence. To be with another person without using them as escape. To choose proximity without relinquishing selfhood. To remain when staying required effort, and to leave when remaining would require erasure. There was no promise embedded in their bond. No assurance of longevity. No fantasy of completion. What they had was something far rarer and far more fragile, a relationship that did not depend on illusion. In a world that rewarded control, they practiced restraint. In a culture that equated love with possession, they chose autonomy. In a narrative that demanded redemption arcs, they accepted incompleteness. They were together not because they needed each other to survive, but because they chose, again and again, to meet in the present without disguising what they were. This was not love as salvation. It was love as risk. Not the reckless risk of surrender, but the conscious risk of remaining open in a reality that offered no guarantees. They did not escape pain. They did not transcend their histories. They did not become safe. They became honest. And in that honesty, stripped of fantasy, stripped of rescue, stripped of the desire to be saved or to save, something durable emerged. Not happiness, not certainty, but a form of connection that did not demand sacrifice of self to exist. In a world that would never become gentle, they did not find shelter. They found integrity. And within that integrity, they discovered a love that did not promise light. Only truth. And for both of them, that was enough. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.